Well, here's the story of Abu Kassem's slippers. Abu Kassem was a merchant. At the time that this story begins, he was a very, very wealthy, prosperous merchant, but that had not always been the case. His beginnings were worse than humble. His beginnings were in the direst poverty. And he started out as an errand runner in the shuk, in the marketplace. He managed to work himself at least into solvency, and finally into a tiny bit of prosperity, and finally into great wealth. And he learned very early one method by which he lived his life, and that was thrift and frugality are really, they're mild terms. Penurious might be a better word. That is, he scrimped on everything. He saved on everything. He never gave, and he didn't give much to himself either. So that he walked around in old clothes. He certainly had a house that functioned, but it didn't look luxurious. He did not give much to his family. He never gave alms. No beggar would think of going near him unless they didn't know him. You see, he knew that if he looked as wealthy as he was, he would have responsibilities to give some of that money away. And more than anything else in the world, he was terrified of becoming poor again. And so he wasn't about to give any of the money away, and he didn't want people to ask him for it. Therefore, he went around dressed like a very poor man, and the symbol of all of this were his slippers. Now, by slippers, we mean the shoes that are worn where he was. Those ones that you slide into, and they have a slight point at the toe. They're well shod in the bottom. They have good leather. Ideally, in the beginning, they're made of a good, soft Cordovan leather. Abu Kassem's slippers were a catastrophe. He had had them resoled. He had had them relined. He had had them patched where little holes and cracks developed. He had had little metal taps put on the bottom to save the soles from wearing out, so he went click, click, click when he walked, the only one to do so. These slippers were the bane of the existence of any cobbler in Baghdad. As soon as a shoemaker saw Abu Kassem coming down the street, he looked to see if he could make his escape and close up shop, because he knew he would be asked to do the impossible job of patching, yet again, these impossible, old, horrific, smelly slippers. But there he was. And one day he made a wonderful business deal. A businessman had gone bankrupt, had to liquidate everything, and he had a huge shipment of very delicate etched crystal bottles with crystal stoppers. Abu Kassem bought them all up for a song. Later in that same day, somebody else who was fleeing from gambling debts and was in danger of losing his life unless he paid some of them off right away, was selling off a large shipment of very precious, exotic attar of roses. This was a wonderful combination. Abu Kassem bought that up too for almost nothing. And he took them both home, knowing that he could put the attar of roses through little funnels into the crystal bottles and really have a very saleable item at a very high price. He was delighted, and everyone in the shuk knew he'd made these wonderful deals. Now, whereas somebody else might take a few colleagues out to dinner to celebrate this, Abu Kassem decided, this was also unusual, that he would treat himself to the one luxury he allowed himself. So he took himself to the hammam, the Turkish bath. And there he met an old colleague. As they were undressing to go into the bath itself, the colleague saw him take off those miserable slippers and said, Abu Kassem, this is a disgrace. You think that because of them people think you're not wealthy? Everybody knows you're wealthy. Everybody knows not to ask you for money. You could at least go around in decent slippers. These are a terrible thing for a man of your stature. And Abu Kassem picked them up and examined them closely and said, I think I can still get some use from these. They'll serve. He put them back down. Then he went to the bath where he relaxed for a few hours. When he came back out, he came to his pile of clothes and he put them on, and then he looked for his slippers, and horror of horrors, he could not find them. They were gone. But right at the bottom of the pile, where his slippers had been, was a pair of gorgeous, fine, new, nearly new, beautifully stitched soft Cordovan leather slippers. And he thought to himself that perhaps this was the gift of a colleague or a friend who thought that such a fine businessman should no longer go around in such ratty slippers. And he was grateful to be saved not only the expense, but the trouble of trying to find the best deal. And thinking for sure they were for him, he slipped his rough, calloused, horny old feet with overgrown and ingrown toenails into those nice new slippers and walked contentedly back to his house. Half an hour later, out from the baths came the Qadi, the judge of the area, and he went to his pile of clothes and put them on, and beneath them found not his nice new slippers, but the clearly identifiable, horrific footgear of Abu Kassem, and he was furious because, of course, he thought the man had done the exchange himself. We don't know to this day who did it. And he sent the constable who dragged Abu Kassem, wearing the stolen items on his very feet, and threw him in jail. They fined him heavily and almost wiped out his profits for the day. And as they sent him out, they gave him back his own slippers. At this point, he was beginning to be angry at these slippers, so once he got into the house, he said, "Look what humiliation, what trouble you've caused me," and he flung them out the window, and the Tigris was below, sort of trickling by. Well, these slippers got fouled in the nets of some fishermen who were slightly upstream, and because of the metal in their soles, they also tore the nets. The fishermen drew the nets up, thinking from the weight they had some fish, and they found Abu Kassem's slippers. They didn't know, these fishermen weren't for that village, they didn't know whose they were, but they were furious. They saw the torn nets, they saw no fish. They threw them from the boat onto the bank, they thought, but it happened to go sailing through a window. It sailed through the window of the room in Abu Kassem's house, where he had just finished filling all the crystal bottles with attar of roses. And they landed with a crash on the table and slid, knocking off whatever bottles they didn't break on first landing, scattering shards of sparkling crystal all over the room, and filling the room with an unbearable strength of attar of roses. He ordered a servant to clean it up. There were the slippers. He picked them up and said, "You've caused me enough trouble for a couple of days. I'm going to finally really get rid of you." And he thought, the only way I'm going to get rid of them, I'm going to bury them. So he took the slippers when it began getting dark and a little spade, because it's embarrassing to admit that slippers are your enemy. And he went into the garden where he thought no one would see, and he dug a hole. And he put the slippers in the hole, and he covered it over, and he went back into the house thinking he was finally done with them and he'd really have to buy new ones. He happened to have a neighbor next door. The neighbor had been keeping an eye on the interesting workings of this house for a long time, and the neighbor had no particular reason to love Abu Kassem. He was a stingy neighbor. He looked at that and he said, "Abu Kassem has servants. He's a wealthy man. If he has taken a spade with his own hand to bury something in his garden, surely he's hiding a treasure. And that's illegal because treasures, of course, the earth and everything that's in it belongs to the Caliph of Baghdad." So he went to the office of the Caliph and reported that his neighbor Abu Kassem had buried a treasure. Abu Kassem was arrested and thrown into jail. And the more he protested that he was only burying an old pair of shoes, the more improbable and incongruous it seemed, the less he was believed. And when the judge was figuring the fine for withholding a treasure, he also figured in the value of what he thought the treasure would be. Abu Kassem was becoming impoverished by the day. He went back furious, and he dug up the slippers because this was not going to work, and he figured the only way to finally get rid of them and all the trouble they were causing him was to go out of town. So the next day he took a little trip into a neighboring village, and he found a deserted pond, he thought, and threw them in, and he went home very sad, very disgusted, and really humiliated. Unfortunately, this pond happened to be the reservoir of the town's drinking supply. And when the slippers got to the pipe, they blocked it up. And when the engineers who came to check why the water wasn't flowing found these slippers blocking the pipe. They knew whose slippers these were. These were famous slippers. Abu Kassem was arrested and thrown into jail again for fouling the city's water supply, and this fine was even worse than the last fine. And as he left, they gave him back the slippers. He was furious, he was miserable. He had never been so miserable in his life since earning a fortune. He took the slippers back and he said, "I'm going to burn you. Then you'll be gone forever." And he took a match to them, and the match went out because, of course, the slippers were soaking and soggy, and they would not burn. So he put them out on the railing of the balcony in the sun for them to dry so he could burn them. His balcony was separated by a small divider from the balcony of the neighbor next door, who kept a medium-sized dog. And we all know, don't we, how curious dogs are about things like shoes, slippers, socks, possessions of neighbors that aren't familiar. And so the dog leaped over the barrier and became curious about the slippers, and he grabbed one in his teeth, and in the process he knocked the second slipper off the balcony, where it fell a great distance and was intercepted from hitting the ground below by the head of a pregnant woman who happened to be passing by, who was both felled and shocked by the slipper falling on her head from such a great height. And her husband heard her fall from 6 paces ahead of her and turned back, and horrified took her immediately to a nearby doctor, taking the slipper with, the cause of the difficulty. And the doctor, thank God, at great expense, saved her from contractions and miscarriage at such an advanced stage of pregnancy. And they presented the bill both for the medical treatment and mental distress and endangering life of a wife, and they presented this entire bill through the court to Abu Kassem, who had to pay up an enormous sum. At which point, the slipper, which was one of the objects held up at the trial, he took these slippers and he held them up to the judge and pleaded with the judge that from now on he be absolved of any responsibility for any further misfortune that these slippers were sure to cause in his life. And the judge laughed so hard that he had to excuse himself and make a dash for the men's room. But he came back, and being a judge and having had to hear with clemency the plea, he decided to absolve Abu Kassem of any further damages resulting from his slippers. And the version of the story that I read said that the moral of the story was to be careful of the damage that could result from not changing your shoes often enough. Now, we all know that this cannot really be the only moral of this story. This story has many implications, and it's the kind of story that works its way into your mind and sort of sinks in there and niggles at the right moments. But I will give you a hint, and that is that Middle Eastern languages are based on 2 or 3 letter roots of a word. And the word for slipper or sandal or shoe, I don't know Arabic, but I do know Hebrew. It's na'al. And that word means lock as well as shoe. So I suspect that the moral of the story is that we must be careful to change the things into which we become locked at regular intervals and not allow them to take such a hold upon us.